There we go. All right. So the recording is going, and this is the March 10th, 2022 Crossplane community meeting. Of first note for tonight is that we want to have a broader discussion with folks here in a synchronous manner for the proposal to merge the JET and Classic providers together. That is listed at the end here, right here. So you can follow along and get some context from this PR right now from this link. But this is what we'll be spending the back half of the meeting discussing today while we have a synchronous quorum gathered up here. So we want to be moving through the agenda at a fairly good pace here, so we can reserve that time at the end for that topic. All right, so let's dive into it then. So yeah, we had a recent release a few days ago, and special thanks to Mohammed. I don't know if he's I don't think he's on the call today, but Mohammed ran this release here, the 1.6.4, to get a couple of patch releases, and mostly the contributing factor for getting that patch release out was to update the version of Go Container Registry, which had some important fixes in it. So it's really good to see new folks running releases and contributing in that way as well. And that's kind of a nice reminder of there's a lot of ways to get involved in various capacities in the community. So definitely grateful to see that. And the release notes are linked here from the agenda document. All right. 1.7 has got a lot going on as we're moving towards the release date of the 22nd. We will be hitting the feature freeze, code freeze dates fairly soon, I believe. Somebody can kind of remind me of when that happens. I think that probably maybe Tuesday of next week, I think, is when we hit feature freeze. And then the following Tuesday would be code freeze before we then do the release the next Tuesday, something along those lines. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but that's the general flow there. About a week for feature freeze, about a week for code freeze, and then we go ahead and do the release. March 22nd is the date we're targeting for getting that shipped and out the door. There's been a lot of work going on here. So let's kind of address some of the important things. So Dan, our beloved Dan Mangum, is not here today, but he did want me to mention that in 1.7, there has been a merge pull request to support the concept of base layers for packages. You can read all about it in the pull request that's linked here, 2932. But this is an important part of the X package specification. So basically the high level gist of it is that Crossplane packages can have multiple layers. So they're OCI images at their core, so they can have multiple layers in it, and you can annotate the one specific layer that you need Crossplane to look at that contains all of your manifests and compositions, etc. That will be at the base layer, and then what this enables now is that you can have arbitrary amounts of other layers into there, so you can contain other types of metadata, information, resources, etc., into your packages now. So the key ask here for the community, since this has been merged, and the X package specification I think was even merged for 1.6, so that's already been in there. But the key ask here for the community is for a little bit of testing effort. So if folks want to take for a test spin in their dev clusters or local clusters, the latest builds for as we're coming up to 1.7, so basically from the main branch, that a little bit more baking and testing on that would be helpful and appreciated, and Dan was requesting that. All right, another pretty important thing in 1.7 is external secret store support. This was a pretty highly demanded feature, and Hassan worked on that and is expecting and anticipating to have it land. Hassan, do you want to add a couple notes on external secret store support and what to expect?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, basically, we are currently planning to ship external secret store as an alpha feature in 1.7, and initially we will be supporting Kubernetes and Vault as secret stores. Kubernetes already was the secret store for Crossplane, but this time it will also be possible to write to external Kubernetes clusters. as well as the in-cluster case, which was already the case. Yeah, currently there are, I think, 2 PRs left, which needs to be merged to have this feature in Crossplane. And then we will start rolling out this feature to providers, and hopefully in the following weeks we will have this feature available in majority of the providers.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic, Hassan. I think that enables a lot of enterprise scenarios for adopting Crossplane and not storing secrets within the cluster. I thought when I was first reading this that all this was about external secret source support, but nope, it's actually other important features that are part of the release that should be landing in 1.7 as well. Wafik, do you want to give us a quick update then on the webhook support?
Yeah, sure. So webhook support is a feature that has been long waited by the community for a lot of use cases. One is being immutability support for things in AWS, for example. Even though you can change some of the stuff in RDS instance, your change on the resource would still go through. So with webhook support, the developers, maintainers of provider AWS would be able to put some functions there to make sure your kubectl edit command would actually fail, saying, hey, this field is immutable. And the other thing that is, I believe, really important is conversion webhooks. We have a lot of V1 Beta 1 resources, and one of the reasons that we don't really push them to V1 is because of the API schema changes, that we don't have a real great story about automatically converting the schema. So this supporting Crossplane, webhook supporting Crossplane will enable all providers to be able to implement their own conversion logic so that they can easily handle such changes, such API changes without distracting users or requiring any manual steps from the users. So in general, this technically enables Crossplane and also providers to have conversion webhooks, admission webhooks to make some checks, and mutating webhooks to mutate the actual CR. So yeah, it will be enabled by default in v1.7, because in order to have it run, you have to give a secret, TLS secret for the certificate stuff. So that would be the toggle of enabling it. If you just do Helm upgrade, Crossplane will just upgrade without any changes in your cluster. So it is safe to enable by default. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that, yeah, as Malcolm was saying, that the contribution that this makes towards our general upgrade and migration stories for maturing resources and changes in providers, et cetera, is quite nice for the community as a whole to be able to absorb changes in a much easier fashion than we've been able to do in the past, or we've held off from doing because it couldn't do it without disruption. So I think this support is quite important for being able to have smooth upgrades in the future. All right, and then CRD scaling is something that we've been working on for a while and having impact upstream as well. And Alper, if you want to give us a quick update on where we're at with that, and then we'll move on from there.
Yeah, hello. So, as you mentioned, we have a recent, one-pager proposal in Crossplane, which discusses issues around CRD scaling. So there are many sorts of analysis in the one-pager. So for folks who are interested in, there is some technical depth in the document. But basically, we have taken a look at, some server-side issues that we have identified or that we are still experiencing, and especially some client-side issues. Maybe one important update is, folks have been reporting, client-side throttling warning messages. And, a performance degradation regarding API server clients like kubectl because of this client-side throttling. There are some details in the document itself, but basically with 1.23, kubectl's discovery client is misconfigured, and it will be correctly configured starting from kubectl 1.24. We have also cherry-picked that fix to the 1.23 release branch, which means that starting with March 16th, we will also have a kubectl version 1.23.5 with correct parameters. And for single provider scenarios, that should basically prevent client-side throttling issues. So there are some, experiments and measurements reported in the document. But basically, even with our largest provider Jet AWS, we'll no longer observe client-side throttling with kubectl. If you want to try this yourself, there is also a kubectl image, Docker image, which you can use. And with that image, you can also configure these parameters like the discovery client's rate limiter parameters, if you'd like. So I don't want to go into details of this document, but one thing that I'd like to especially mention is, as part of this effort, we would like to agree on some common cross-plane scenarios. And for this purpose, initially we have just suggested two scenarios. One is, being able to install a single provider, which is basically the base scenario. But the other one is, for example, being able to install all of the three big Terajet-based providers onto the same Kubernetes cluster. So we would like to define a set of scenarios like these, and then define a set of goals to achieve, performance goals. I mean, like if a single provider is installed in the cluster, and if you run a kubectl command, for example, against this cluster with a cold cache, then it should take, for example, at most 10 seconds, given or assuming that no errors occur, of course, to complete the discovery phase and to have a result from the kubectl command. And similar goals, similar things defined for the second scenario of installing all providers, etc. So what we are trying to understand, and what we are trying to get feedback from the community is, the common scenarios they are using. For example, we wonder if any Crossplane community member, installs all of these three providers and, tries to use them in production, or plans to do this and things like that. So feedback on the issue would be very much appreciated, because using this, we will try to define our goals and achieve them, and also make sure that we maintain them.
Alper, yeah, I think that the work we're doing upstream and driving fixes into API server, into control is quite helpful in terms of scaling the ability for the control plane to be able to handle what we're doing with it. So feedback is welcomed into that document here, and the link is right here. And yep, so thank you everybody for pretty good and interesting stuff that's going into 1.7. Let's keep on going to make it to the end here, where we can have the broader discussion about the merging proposal. But yeah, so let's stay on track here. So Matthias, I think, did some work to gather stats or gather information around the provider adoption in the broader ecosystem, and folks that are writing and building providers. So there's a link here to see Matthias's efforts on that. and what he's found. And there's no doubt about it that with better code gen foundation now, where people are much more people are starting to build their own providers for new scenarios and new environments that we hadn't really even thought of as a community ourselves before. So it's really cool to see that, and you can see some details in Matthias's repo there. Moafik, you want to give us a quick update on TerraJet as it's at its core there before we move on?
Yeah, sure. I'll be real quick. So 0.4.2 is released with a bunch of bug fixes, and the second one is Grpc performance test. So there's this test. There are these tests that we wanted to do about whether we should have the Terraform CLI talk with a single up and running, long running Grpc provider server, because that's what the TF providers are, or we should use it in normal mode that for every call it spins up a new one and then shuts it down for every call. And apparently with this issue you can see the results of comparing the two, and we are going to implement having a single provider Grpc provider server instance up and running in the container that Terraform continuously talks with, because it reduces our time to readiness time and the CPU usage, but memory usage is not that affected. And the third one, Alper can give more details if he wants to, but is about scraping the TF registry for metadata extraction, which today we use for example YAML generation. You can see the one page and look at the approach and comment on it. Yeah,
and I think thanks for that update there, Moafik. And then we'll have this one available for folks to comment on, and I think we could skip that one today for going into details in this call though. So there's a lot of progress on all sorts of stuff. That's kind of quite exciting to see. Okay, then I think there have been a number of other releases of other providers. This is just the one that was right off the top of my head because Christopher donated it to the Crossplane Crd org just yesterday. So it's interesting to see, this is a good example of being able to code gen a Crossplane provider with fairly minimal effort and be able to control other parts of your pipelines and environment. So now you can use Crossplane to manipulate or integrate with PagerDuty as well. So Christopher, thank you very much for donating that to the Crossplane Crd organization and your efforts on that, man. Christopher, do you want to go ahead and speak about the upcoming provider AWS release that is scheduled for tomorrow?
Yeah. We will release tomorrow the next provider release, 0.25. There is a big change for the SDK upgrade and ACK bump. I tested a lot of all resources from the code generator stuff, and I think we have also a lot of new resources inside. And we fix a lot of things in the RDS resource group. Yes. And thanks for Moafik to review my big PR for the SDK bump. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the testing effort on that as well, Christopher. The efforts that you go through to make sure that resources and manifests and things in your environments are still working has been a nice integration suite, essentially, in addition to what we already have in repo. So that's been really helpful. Great. Yep. So getting out provider AWS tomorrow will be a good update to have there and continue moving along with that provider. I don't think we have big updates in this community meeting for GCP and Azure, but that's okay because we'll be talking about the merging of those the classic providers and jet providers, which has big impact on that. When it gets to everything else here, keep on moving. So there's, as usual, there's a list of resources and content that I gathered before the meeting here of interesting blog posts, videos, and people generally talking and sharing about Crossplane and things you can do with it. So probably one of the most interesting and unexpected one was Aaron's teaching Crossplane to play poker one, which is a treat to read and get into that and kind of using that as a metaphor almost for understanding some of the concepts in Crossplane. So this could be quite of an interesting intro for folks to understand a little bit more about some of the concepts and capabilities of the project. So thanks for writing that one, Aaron, and thanks for keeping it a secret too, that nobody really knew about it until it just dropped today. I think another interesting thing that's probably worth mentioning is Taylor wrote about the VS Code plugin. I think it works for Goland as well, but I'm not sure if that one is explicitly released. But that is improving the story around authoring your own compositions and compiler resources and things like that. Where it'll give you immediate feedback and IntelliSense and errors and stuff like that while you're authoring it, as opposed to having to do that downstream later on after you built the package and installed it at runtime. So shifting left on catching issues on building your compositions and platform, and it's quite a nice experience to have that now. And there's more to come with that, but you can catch up with what Taylor wrote about that in this link right here. All right, Nick, are you on the call, my friend? Yes, you are. Do you want to catch us up on custom composition progress?
Yep, I would recommend anyone who wants to go deep. There is a updated sketch design doc that has a proposal for an API in there. And I'm also linked through to the notes. But basically, Sergen, who is on the call, Sergen Yeltsin, has been doing most of the heavy lifting. It's got a couple of proof of concepts that have de-risked the way that we want to do it, and we're moving on to the design doc. I think that's about it for this context. But as I say, please, we have a Slack channel that you can find if you click that sync custom compositions notes. So if anyone's really interested in this topic, join us on Slack and hit us up there.
Yeah, thanks for that update there, Nick, and then thanks, Sergen, as well, for the effort that you've been putting into that and the progress that are contributing to that effort. So that's good stuff. And yeah, and I like that what we're doing there with having a special interest group that's formed around this effort. And we keep up to date with the progress on it in the deep dive and the notes here that we have linked. So that's really good. I'm definitely excited to see this come out over the next couple of releases.
Yeah, I think 1.8, I think, by the way, is what we're thinking for the releases. It's not quite going to make 1.7, but hopefully 1.8.
Yep, that's totally reasonable. Okay, sweet. So for KubeCon EU in Valencia, Spain, in the middle of May, about 2 months from now, a couple updates. Our maintainer track session was accepted. So this will be the first time, I believe, that Crossplane as an incubation project is now on the maintainer track. So we'll be able to do a introduction and deep dive session that will reach a broader audience, which is really cool. So that was accepted. That will be in person in Valencia. We also got a virtual office hours accepted as well. So we'll be able to run an online virtual session, which is a lot of similar content, but being able to reach the audience that is not able to attend KubeCon in person. So we've got a couple different means there for ways that we'll be able to connect the general core of the project to the broader ecosystem that will be attending KubeCon. I have not yet heard back on if we have the in-person kiosk like booth as well. That's part of the project pavilion, but we do have the maintainer track and we do have the office hours, virtual office hours already confirmed. So I'll let everybody know what I hear about the kiosk, and if folks want to come hang out there and talk to people and stuff when you're in Valencia, then that sounds great. Just let me know about that. There's a number of other talks that I heard were accepted from folks on this call. I think Muaf has one, Hassan, Alper, Matthias, Victor also has one. So a whole bunch of talks got accepted, which is really cool. So I think there's going to be a whole bunch of Crossplane and related topics that will be spoken on stage in Valencia. So it seems like this community here is going to have a big showing, not only of content, but people as well. So still thinking about doing a little gathering and getting a little get together of folks from the community here in Valencia for anybody else who was able to make it. All right, so I think we're doing okay on time here. And then, so yeah, we can go into this discussion as well. So Jillian, I believe that this was one that you added, is that correct?
Yep, I can be super quick because
Right.
Nick, I saw that you replied back to this, and thank you, Christopher, for sending it. I know we've had this conversation multiple times about supporting like patching from using a config map or not. Curious on the viability of this PR, or if we're thinking about doing something like this in a different manner.
I would love to I haven't checked this PR there's been updates since last time I looked at it. I'd love to hear feedback on this UX from other folks. To me personally, patching from an object outside of a composition as part of a composition's functionality seems a little off UX wise, but you know, I am but one person. If everyone loves this this UX, we could potentially proceed with it.
So we also running this since 2 days in our environments because we are in sync with the guys from Accenture and from Deutsche Bahn, and we using this a lot.
How does it work with regard to RBAC? Wouldn't this mean that Crossplane would need RBAC access to read basically anything that, you know, in a config map, for example?
We added the RBAC thing in our GitOps tooling in Flux, for example, and this is not a problem for us. So if you want, I can share a little bit how we are doing this in our compositions and the RBAC stuff around. I can add this in the PR.
Yeah, dropping some context in there would be nice. I mean, one possible simplification is we could just hard code it so that this only supports config maps, let's say, and then that arguably
that's the only thing. Yeah, we using also the config maps only, so not secrets or something like this. But for config maps, it's really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, we really want this feature. This is just one of those awkward things where patching from arbitrary resources, the potential to have generic resource references that we've looked in a little bit before in the past, just all kind of have a lot of interplay with each other. So it's one of those ones where we want to, you know, pause and make sure we get the API right before we commit to anything. Otherwise, we end up with, you know, a jumbled sort of mess of 3 different ways to do the same thing. So do want to proceed with this. I haven't had too much time to look at it. I would definitely love to get, like, you know, Move Off and other folks who are pretty deep on composition to weigh in on it.
Yeah, just a quick comment on it. I believe so one of my main concerns with the generic references was the security aspect of it, having, like, you know, giving Crossplane access to essentially everything, and the composition writer like access to everything in the cluster in any namespace. But, like, you know, if we end up, like, you know, hey, like, you know, this is not a problem security wise because composition writers are almost admins anyway, I would kind of prefer it to be on a managed resource level so that it is available both for composition users and managed resource users. So you can think of some one array in spec of the RDS instance, let's say, some kind of, like, you know, patches that similar to patches that you have in composition, so that, like, even though you don't use composition, you would be able to do the patching from other resources, and then if you need it, you can change that patch parameters within the composition that you have here. But yeah, my main concern was, like, you know, the access control aspect of it.
Mr. MX, who raised the pull request, I had mentioned also a preference to do this at the managed resource level, and he sort of responded by saying that one downside of that is that you need to build it into every provider, which is true. So there is some niceness of just sort of implementing it in one place in Crossplane. But you know, the RBAC thing as well does concern me, because, you know, if we effectively say any composition, even if you just give it RBAC access to config maps, I suppose you could lock Crossplane down to have config maps only in any namespace, but at this point, like, Crossplane, presumably if you just say Crossplane has access to read config maps in general, then anyone who could write a composition could just pull any data out of any config map anywhere in the cluster and patch from it, which is a bit of a blast radius there. One thing we could potentially, just talking off the top of my head, one thing we potentially do to, like, lock this down would be to introduce a very config map like type that is Crossplane specific, effectively, to just say at least you won't be able to read config maps that aren't for Crossplane. But I think the long story short, this seems like something that kind of needs a one-pager to make sure we get alignment on. But I am really glad that I don't actually know his name, but Mr. MX is you know, driving this forward and sparking conversation.
Yeah, I can totally agree with that as well. That, you know, I like that Max is driving this, and then also, you know, there's a clear need in the community for something along this. So getting the API right, getting the security concerns right, you know, we don't want to rush that and make some mistakes that we can't walk back. But I love seeing this moving forward and the enthusiasm on this. So this is fantastic. All right, and thank you for bringing that up, Jillian. All right, so I think we raced through and got through most everything here on the agenda of 25 minutes left. So let's then go ahead and jump into it here since we wanted about 30 and we've got 25. So I have a hard stop here at the top of the hour. So if the conversation does continue and folks do want to stay on for it or can stay on for it, then I can make somebody else the host and I'll take off. But I think Muafik, you want to start driving this then, or Nick, who wanted to start the conversation?
Yeah, I can start with a short short presentation of the latest status, because I believe not everyone has checked the latest updates. So we might.
Do you want to share your screen?
Yeah.
And move up.
Okay,
Can you start with just just to speak for a minute about the general problem and just give everyone the background in case they haven't read the issue?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, this is the proposal to merge the three providers. We have Jet AWS and AWS provider, Jet GCP and GCP provider. So the problem that we have been facing since the release of these providers is that people have been asking us, hey, now you have Jet providers and also classic providers, which one we should use? And our answer has been hey, if you want maturity and the classic provider meets your needs, you can use that one. But if there are resources that doesn't meet your needs, you can use Jet provider, which has a lot of resource coverage. However, this has been confusing for a lot of people, and we were expecting it to be confusing, honestly. If you go ahead and check the initial discussion about this in provider strategy doc, that you will see that this was called out as one of the costs of our initial decision. But for the reasons listed there, that we wanted the initial reasons to be separate and see how they're used and how people receive those providers, and just to make sure we first see people using it and dropping feedback, so that we can later on make a new release decision if needed. So this proposal is about that discussion. Now that people have used Jet providers and also classic providers, they have more ideas about how they look like, what are the downsides or upsides of using Jet providers compared to provider AWS or the classic providers. So that is why we want to start this discussion again and propose that. So here, actually, let me go through the options real quick in the provider strategy doc. One option is completely separate providers, which is what we have today. And the second option, option B, is one provider, but Jet-based resources in their own API group. Think of it you've got iam.aws.crossplane.io. You would have iam.aws.jet.crossplane.io as well. So that they would be completely different, each CRD, and you would differentiate, hey, okay, this is TerraJet based because it has Jet in its group name. And the option C is no difference in the API, because the API is same, CRD's shape is same, schema is convention XRM compliant, so implementation does not really matter for the users. So these were the options, and we went for option A. This is proposing option C. So I will just go back to the goals so that we are setting the ground for what we want to achieve at the end of what is the end game. So for providers, we have three goals. One is we would like cloud vendors to maintain them, essentially, because I believe Nick will share some thoughts around Crossplane's charter. But we are thinking that the only way it's scalable for those providers is to get cloud vendors maintain them. And this is like, more possible with Crossplane being a CNCF project, and then like, vendor neutral, with the vendor neutral governance compared to other products in the industry. The second goal is that the coverage. We want users to be able to do anything they would like with Crossplane in terms of infrastructure. And the third one is those providers should be mature enough for people like, to depend on in production. So with these three goals in mind, and here there's like a small status summary that we have, like, number of CRDs, and like, I have used beta as like a proxy for maturity. It's not really like, very accurate, but still like, it gives you an idea of like, how many of those are like, mature enough to be beta. And the comparisons of CRD numbers, I mean, this is like just like, significant difference. So yeah, the proposal is that we are, first of all, we are making decisions only for these three providers. All other JET providers or classic providers are free to like, go with their choices, their own choices. So like, this is only for these three providers, and like, maintain our goals of these three providers. The two decisions are, well, first one is there will be a single provider instead of one JET, one classic. I believe that decision is like, a little bit less controversial than the other. So there will be a single provider. And the second decision is that the single provider will be the classic one, and we will add CRDs on top, meaning that, for example, today AWS has 124 CRDs. We will add the rest with JET CRDs to complete it to the like, full coverage. And then there is a guideline here that I will go through in a minute to like, to let you know how we would convert one from one to the other. Like, should we, for example, change the VPC to TeraJet based implementation, or like, when do we convert a JET implementation to a classic one? So just to make it like, more concrete in your mind, I will talk about like, the order of execution. For example, for AWS, which has the most number of resources. So what will happen is that we will add TeraJet pipeline to the provider repository, similar to ACK that we have today. We will have only the V1 Alpha 1, 2 resources from JET providers that have the manual resource configurations, which are, I believe, around 80, and the ones that are only like, not existing in the classic provider. For example, I believe we have RDS instance both in JET and classic, so we will not copy that resource. The existing one will stay at the moment, and we will not add all resources, like 700 resources, to the actual release. In the third step, we will have the full set of CRDs similar to JET provider in a different branch, essentially, with a different version. For example, when we release 0.26, we will also release 0.26-preview. And the former will have only the manually configured and tested ones, as well as the classically written ones. The latter, the preview suffix one, would have everything we can generate. And then we will write up a guide or tool, likely a tool, to help the current users of JET providers that are on like V1 Alpha 2 resources to migrate to provider AWS. Many of those resources are not existing, I believe, so it will only be about like, API group change. But for the ones that we don't move over, like RDS instance, there will be some schema changes, so we will need to handle that in that tool, with that tool. So coming to the latest, to the section that I updated very recently. So there is this section that we are, I believe, getting on the same page, is that the end goal, like, in an ideal world, we would like a provider to have a single implementation, so that like, we have the homogeneity in the code base, that it's easier to maintain, easier to debug for users, and that would be a single tool to use. So right now, we believe that TeraJet, in the proposal, we believe that TeraJet is that tool for today. And most of the resources in an ideal world, like 100% of the resources would be on TerraJet. However, TerraJet has its own strategic, let's say shortcomings. For example, there is a bug in Terraform that is not solvable in a meaningful time frame, or they just decide to not fix it. And say, I believe we had a problem like this in Azure Kubernetes service, where they say Azure API is wrong, and then so you would have to wait for 2 parties to fix, which would make 6 months. So in such cases, for example, you would be able to convert it to classic implementation in order to fix that resource and get it into a working state. So for such exceptions, so there will be such exceptions at all times, but the end goal is to reach a homogen provider. However, there will not be a push to convert everything that we have today to a jet-based implementation right away. There is a guideline here with more details, but I will just go through this section. So there is this the end goal, but also at the same time competing factor of that any kind of conversion from native to jet, from classic to jet, or from jet to classic bears a cost of testing, and also it bears some level of risk for existing users. Excuse me. The API schema changes are really straightforward and easy to handle with conversion webhooks, thanks to the power of Kubernetes API that we depend on. But the actual control implementation, what I call provisioning behavior, is different than can be different in Terraform and the implementation that you would have in the classic means. And the difference is mostly with complex resources. So I give an example here. For example, an AWS RDS instance is a complex resource where you affect the provisioning behavior with some of the values and fields and conventions in the API. Instead of create RDS instead, you would call restore RDS from S3 call, make that call, for example. So if you look at Terraform code, you would see a lot of these knobs being specific logic to it. And you would see the same thing in Crossplane code base as well. When you compare that to IAM role, for example, it is mostly hey, what's in the observe is get role. What's in create is create role. So it's a very simple CRUD application, CRUD set of methods called whenever needed. So for the latter, for IAM role, we are saying that you don't need much of a justification to make the conversion, because if you have time, if you are able to extensively test it, that the behavior doesn't change because the cost there is low and the risk is low, you can do that. But for more complex one, like our AWS RDS instance, the cost is higher, so we would need more justification to take on that challenge to convert it. But at the end of the day, our goal is to get to a place where the tool that is decided for that specific provider has the most is the prevailing technology in that provider. And I give here an example of for example, a year from now, it could be AWS Cloud Control for provider AWS when they do decide to come in and maintain. Let's say in that case, that would be the tool that we would like to get every resources implemented. I mean, depending on what they want, they might want to bootstrap another provider, or they might just come in as maintainers and slowly migrate over. But the end goal is essentially there is this specific technology for a given provider, and that is the end goal, and we are getting there fast, maybe in a fast way with simple resources, but more slowly with the complex resources, so that our users do not experience a lot of they don't face a lot of risks with API changes. So that is the proposal, and then we get into more details about why we do it. And I believe going through a few of them, but to quickly mention, One is dependence on Terraform provider. But these parts, I believe, did not change much since the initial PR opening. So I don't actually want to go into detail so that we have more times for discussion. And there are some drawbacks and what others did. So I'm assuming, like, you have all read the initial version, at least initial version of this document. I am leaving the ground for discussion.
Yeah, any questions or comments from folks so far, especially curious about folks who aren't, like you, Jillian, who haven't been working at Upbound and thinking about this like some of us have for a while.
Loads of questions. So one, I'm like not opposed to combining to one provider. The conversation of going between Jet and Classic, I think that we can acknowledge that Jet is more feature complete against any of the Classic resources, right? Because Terraform's been around for much longer. So what I'd struggle with is, let's use RDS as an example, right? It's a more complex resource. We have it on Classic, we have it on Jet. Jet is feature complete. The same would be for DynamoDB and S3, where we have issues with S3 and late initialization, right? We continue to have bugs around that. So for these resources, like, I like that it'll be one API, but then I also kind of think that maybe until the Classic, because I like ACK generated better, right? Code generation off of code generation just kind of makes me feel weird, right? Using Terraform to generate code. I like the ACK Classic approach better. But for things like RDS, I'm much more inclined to go to the TerraJet provider if it's available, because it has everything we need and I can get adoption much faster. And so when we say, hey, we already have RDS for Classic, so we're not going to take the Jet, kind of hurts a little bit, because I would argue that maybe they both could live. Like maybe you have two APIs for that in those scenarios where eventually the idea is to collapse down to one version until one wins out, right? So maybe Classic. If the path forward is for cloud providers to maintain these providers, I would think that Classic eventually would want to win out over TerraJet.
Jillian, would you just a follow-up question regarding your sort of preference to keep the two implementations of RDS, for example? Would you have any preference for those two implementations living in sort of one provider, or would you be fairly happy with the status quo of just, installing Jet one?
I'm fine if it's in one provider, two APIs.
Sorry, I didn't quite hear that. Can you say
one provider, two APIs is fine for me.
Is it fine or like better in any, like, I guess what I'm saying is where my mind goes is if we want to keep, the option to install the Jet ones and the option to install the sort of Classic or native ones, is there actually a problem with the status quo where we have two separate ones? And this is something we've had mixed feedback on personally. Like, some folks, what we're seeing from the community is a lot of people just by having a choice, the natural thought rather is, well, which one's better? Which one should I pick? Whereas other people are sort of, similar to what I think you're saying, is like, they're just like, oh, there's two choices and I'm happy to install both and I can mix and match them.
Right. So for us, outside of like the scaling issues that we are already hitting with all the CRDs, I'd have no problem installing both providers versus just one. I think from like all of us who manage the Kubernetes clusters, two AWS providers kind of hurts, because then they're like, that's weird, versus one AWS provider with a host of options, right? And knowing what's under the covers, knowing that if I could choose a Jet resource for things that I know that are more feature complete over a Classic resource, that would be nice. But I'm only really going after my own goals of what we're trying to get to production super fast, and a little bit more reliable. But yeah. I like, but my preference is always for the Classic over Jet. It's just Classic's not fully there yet on all the resources.
Yeah, well, one thing to add about the conversion is that, like, we won't really, like, say you cannot convert the RDS instance. It is just that, like, because it would require extensive testing, it is just like, harder to do. But for example, in your case, let's say Terraform 1 is like, more featureful. So like, you can open a PR, for example, to convert it to Jet and like, show, hey, like, these are the cases that we tested, like, because the end goal is to converge on TerraJet, we would be happy to accept the PR and like, convert its implementation to a Jet one.
Right. And I think I would look at the, like, if all your users who are moving from Terraform to Crossplane, the lack of functionality, I think, may be what hurts people from fully onboarding to Crossplane as quickly as they want to. I would tell you that that's probably our number one, right? Is that, if we don't have all of the feature functionality, it's harder for us to move fast, right? To gain adoption and then to truly spend more time in cross-plane functionality versus resource functionality, right? That shouldn't be my biggest problem. My biggest, like, the fun things are like the cross-plane infrastructure and, managing things to that part, but we can't fully get there because of lack of provider functionality.
Yeah, I think Mavav touched on this, but I want to provide a little bit more color on our long-term thinking. There is a document that exists only within the steering committee at the moment that is touching on our what's in scope and our goals for the Crossplane project more broadly, a little bit longer term. It's not quite ready to share yet, but I think one thing that we all agree on is what Mavav said, that we want, pardon me, our goal is for any provider, not just the big three. Our ideal is that the owner of the API that we're interfacing with owns that provider. We know we're not going to get there for everything, but the idea is that we'd love AWS to own and maintain the AWS provider. We'd love GitLab to own and maintain the GitLab provider, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And one thing we've noted, if we look at the big three cloud providers, if we look at how in some cases they own their Terraform providers, in some cases they don't, and they all have sort of Kubernetes controllers effectively. One thing we've noticed is that they actually don't tend to lean towards what we would consider a classic or a native implementation, which honestly is my sort of personal preference as a way to build this. But if you look at Terraform, it took them 7 years to get to where they are at the moment with the AWS provider. So what we've seen is Azure uses Azure Resource Manager, which is sort of a standardization API that is kind of like an intermediary. It's in some ways like Terraform, except it's hosted by them. Amazon, it seems to be, it's hard to tell, but it seems like they're pushing their new cloud control API, and it's unclear how that's going to relate to ACK going forward, whether the two projects will continue to exist or whether sort of cloud control will become the new hotness. That's what the official Terraform provider is planning to move to. That's similar to ARM with Azure. It's sort of like an intermediary, almost like a CloudFormation Lite API. And then Google's taking an approach of releasing this declarative configuration library, which they're planning to build all of their providers around. So one thing that we've been thinking of is let's say in a year or two, we're hoping to have enough traction, and there's some promise with the conversations we're having with these big providers. Let's say we're hoping to have enough traction that they come in and they say, yeah, we're happy to own and maintain our provider. One problem is we just have no signal that writing native code is going to mean anything. That in fact, there's a good chance that we could spend a year porting everything to like the classical implementations, and they could just throw it all out and say, well, thank you, but we've decided to come and own our provider, and we're going to generate it using AWS Cloud Control. So we've considered, well, we could try and second guess and say, oh, AWS probably is going to use Cloud Control, Azure is probably going to use ARM, so we could try and build things that way. But one of the challenges is we just have a pool of like 5 to 7 people who are maintaining the big three providers. So building 3 different code generation pipelines is tough. So part of the reason that we're thinking of going to TerraJet here or Terraform is really just because while fundamentally I do agree with your assessment, Jillian, that the classic, the native implementations are better in a lot of ways. We just don't have good signal for these big three that it's worth the effort to write all of those. And so then given a choice between being consistent or not, my preference is that we don't have a mix of multiple different implementations where people have to maintain the classic RDS and the TerraJet RDS all within like one provider. for a significant amount of time.
So I hate to say this, and why not just go Jet all the way?
That's effectively what we're doing. That's basically what we're trying to push for. I think what we're trying to, well, me personally, I shouldn't speak for everyone, but I think one thing we considered was we could just deprecate the provider AWS, right? We could just say it's we're not going to release it anymore. It's we recommend everyone moves to Jet, but then everyone has a migration to do. If you're using RDS today on provider AWS, you have to port over to the slightly different Jet APIs. So effectively what we're trying to do, I think, is what I'm saying is we should merge them together and then set an aggressive timeline to effectively align them, slowly remove the native controllers and replace them with TerraJet ones. And by merging them together, that means we can use the webhook-based approach that Muvar said, so that we can sort of serve, we can introduce the new API shape while still supporting the old one, so we can sort of more transparently migrate to TerraJet. We can also do things like add feature flags so that you can choose when the controller code switches over from native to TerraJet. And then the general idea is that sort of gets everyone who is a contributor working on the same platform, like everyone's contributing to TerraJet. You get sort of that force multiplier of like all of, and if you fix a bug, there's a good chance you fix a bug for everyone, for every controller.
Right.
And there was one more point that I wanted to make that keeps slipping out of my mind. Oh yeah, just reiterating what Muvar said. We do always think that there's going to be like some small exceptions just because some resources have weird bugs or just don't work with TerraJet. So the way that I think about it is like, if you have 100 resources in a provider, I would like 97 of those resources to be TerraJet, and the ones that aren't to have like some explicit reason, like we couldn't use TerraJet here because X or Y. So this is like an exception, but it's a very small part of the code base rather than 20 or 50% of the code base being sort of classic.
That I like that versus saying classic beats Jet, Jet beats classic.
Right. And that this confuses a lot of folks because there is a lot of subtleties with TerraJet. Like, we've used the term temporary when talking about Terraform a lot, and in certain contexts that is true. Like, if you ask me in 5 years, will we be on Terraform? Hopefully not. Selfishly, I would like Crossplane to have won and Terraform to not be a thing anymore in 5 years or 10 years, right? But that's a long time away. Terraform's not going anywhere anytime soon. And I think we can cross that bridge when we come to it. And hopefully in 5 years, AWS will have come and like taken ownership of their provider, or if they don't, we'll have a great team of 10 maintainers who can like figure out a better way to just work on provider AWS every day. So hopefully, we can scale by living on TerraJet for a couple of years and then look at this again in the future.
Yeah. So I think that given that, my preference would be for Jet to beat out Classic, and then for the scenarios in which Classic has solved certain bugs that aren't exist, I would go that. That would be my preference. And also to go to one, personally, that would be my preference, to go to one provider. I think that'll also benefit you because where Kubevela, right, helps with is a complement to Crossplane in some aspects, but there's also like the Terraform controller through Kubevela, or that was created by those folks, not on the same offering, in some level of abstraction. I think that having played with both, I would prefer and us using Kubevela as well, my preference would be to have Crossplane resources alongside Kubevela versus a mix of Terraform controller Crossplane.
Yeah, you should let the Kubevela folks know that we're friends with them, and Will, who maintains their Terraform controller, also maintains the various Alibaba providers for Crossplane. So I'm sure he'd appreciate that feedback.
Yeah. I think Julian, we are on the same page, and I think me and Nick have some a discussion about how to go there. We're all on the hey, Jet is the end goal point of view, but it's just how we go there and how aggressive we will be about the conversion is a little bit of the topic of discussion. But I would also like to get some opinions from Christopher as well. Now that we're over time, but I would like to get some thoughts.
Me too. I just want to provide a tiny bit of context about the timing as well. Muvar mentioned that there's two things here, right? I think the aggressiveness of porting over to TerraJet, one is just the more aggressively we do that, the more risk there is for users. You know, if we just ported all 100 resources in one release, you know, there's a great chance for breaking. So we can address that with feature flags, etc. The other challenge, somewhat selfishly for those of us who work at Upbound, is that, you know, MoveOff's team of, you know, 4 folks at Upbound does a lot of the maintenance of this, and I don't want to be like, hey, folks, spend the next 3 months doing nothing but porting resources over to TerraJet. So part of it is, you know, I don't think we necessarily want to be like not aggressive about this, but we might do it by, you know, doing a shout out to the community and like, you know, doing it in a sustainable way rather than just like dedicating every maintainer on provider AWS to port resources for the next month or 2.
Yeah.
Are you still around, Christopher?
Mhm.
Might not be.
Yeah, sorry.
Curious, you know, what your thoughts were on all of this. I think I saw you weigh in on the issue, right?
So in general, our thoughts in the company is we had a big issue at the end with a lot of CRDs in the clusters, because for governance reason, we need to limit what we are doing on our Kubernetes clusters. And with the jet providers, we add a lot of more CRDs. This is our only concern. And if you have, so for example, the native ones and the TerraJet ones together in one provider, this is not a big issue for us, because today we also running both providers in our environments, but we are running custom builds. So that means that we drop all CRDs out of the jet providers and also out of the native providers we are not using, because then otherwise we had a lot of discussions with the governance here, why we had so much CRDs there, and we need to clarify for each CRD why we're using them. And then we also need to check how our IAM policies looks like, for example. The only thing we have in concern is how does it looks like for the SDK version. So for example, the Go SDK version 2, because we have in the native provider resources depending on the Go version. And I think also the TerraJet is depending on Go SDK version 2. How does it looks like with the different versions, so that we need to sync them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I believe that would be like, you know, in the context of like, you know, the conversion, like the initial merge will not make any kind of changes in that, because like, you know, since we're spinning up a Terraform CLI call, we don't have to move to what Go SDK that TF provider uses. So like, you know, once we merge them, and then like, you know, we can think of like, you know, specific resource by resource, like, you know, hey, DynamoDB table, like, you know, when we convert it to TerraJet, we will see like, you know, API schema, for example, and like, you know, see the behavior. So if it's like, you know, the same, then it's like, you know, easier to convert regardless of the SDK version. So it will be like, you know, in the bucket of the conversion risk essentially.
Okay. Yeah, then so in general, we have not a big issue with this if we merge them, and if we have time to decide in future in which direction we go. Yeah, because fair enough, we're running both providers today in the clusters. So
Gotcha. Thanks. Yeah, folks, please drop comments on the PR as well about your thoughts and concerns and context, so that like, you know, other people can read them and like, you know, have more idea about like, you know, different use cases that we need to address. I believe we will have this open for until the next community meeting as well, and then like, you know, either on that meeting or close to that meeting, we will plan to either like, you know, decline it or merge it essentially. So yeah, please feel free to like, you know, leave more comments in your use cases to help the discussion go forward. And yeah, with that, we are already 9 minutes over time. So sorry for that additional time, folks, and see you 2 weeks later. Have a great day.
thanks.
Bye.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.